Hello, welcome to the Inside Killeen podcast from KDH News. My name is Jacob Brooks, co-host of the Inside Killeen, a podcast about news, events, and politics in the Killeen-Fort Hood area. With me today is my Inside Killeen co-host, Kevin Limiti.
Hey, how's it going?
And our guest today is KDH News military editor, Brent Johnson.
Howdy, howdy.
Brent covers military news in and around Fort Hood, which shares a long history with Killeen. We are recording from the KDH News studio, which is inside the newsroom at KDH News in Killeen. And today we're going to talk about the name of Fort Hood, which has gone through some name changes recently. In a formal Army ceremony on Monday, July 28th, 2025, that was 4 days ago, the local Army installation formerly known as Fort Cavazos for about 2 years, was redesignated Fort Hood, its old name, in a morning ceremony outside 3 Corps headquarters. Now, before we kind of get into that ceremony, Brent, and you were there, I do want to mention that, talk a little bit about the history. This Fort Hood goes back about 80-something years, and during World War II. And even before that, or in the early 40s, there was talk of establishing an Army training post in the area, but I think it really got going after December 7th, 1941. That's when Pearl Harbor happened. And in September 1942, Camp Hood was officially established after the government took a lot of that land through eminent domain, where communities were forced to move out, after decades of living in the area. So for about 80 years, from 1942 to 2023, there was first Camp Hood and then Fort Hood, and then it became Fort Cavazos. But most people around here, they all know it as Fort Hood. Now, I was a soldier stationed at Fort Hood in the early 90s, so I have my own, it's one of the places I've lived. But Brent, when did you first hear of Fort Hood?
So I grew up in North Carolina, so quite a ways away from Texas, and I didn't know a whole lot about the Army. The only active duty person at the time was my cousin, who was in the Marine Corps, that I knew of. So the first time I ever heard of it was the shooting, of course, Nadal Hassan.
In 2009.
Yes, in 2009.
You just heard about it in the news.
Just in the news. That's basically the first time I ever heard about it. I've heard about it, over the years, being myself in the Marine Corps, and I hear about conditions at Fort Hood. Never sounded too great in the past.
Even though it's the great
years.
place.
Even though it's the great place.
Which is Fort Hood's nickname.
Right. Every time I talk to a soldier, because I trained with soldiers sometimes, they were like, "Well, I sure hope I don't go to Hood," and so it was only passing references to Fort Hood.
But now you're very familiar with it. You go there to cover it. You were there today, right? At the stables outside the gate?
I went by the stables. I was actually a little late, and they were wrapping up the cavalry detachments demonstration, which we of course talked about the horse cavalry going out the door in a previous, I guess, my previous guest appearance. I guess I was 2 or 3 episodes ago, and there were a lot of people there. It was tough to get parking. So, yeah, that's.
I wonder if our podcast had anything to do with that.
It's possible.
How would you describe Fort Hood to somebody who's never been there?
It's just a really big Army base. That's they say, I think, was it 40% of the Army's combat power? That might be three corps in general, but that's the overseers of that 40% of the Army's land combat power is stationed here.
I think right now it's like 37,000 troops, and of course hundreds of tanks and
Right.
Bradleys and helicopter, all kinds of
There's
weapons and vehicles. And things
Yeah,
like that.
there's a lot of gear. There's a lot of armored vehicles, and the soldiers to crew them, and a lot of helicopters as well. So, yeah, it's quite a large installation. It expands all the way up near Gatesville, and up there is kind of a lesser known part of Fort Hood, which is where the National Guard trains to mobilize for deployments overseas.
North Fort Hood.
Right, North Fort Hood, and then West Fort Hood is down southern Killeen, I guess, and that's just a shared use facility with the Killeen Regional Airport, which used to be called Killeen Fort Hood Regional Airport. There's a lot of military flights take off out of there and send troops on their way to wherever they're deploying to. So a very large center of combat power in the Army.
Kevin, what's your perception of Fort Hood? Have you been on Fort Hood before?
Nope, I have not.
Are you curious?
I am well, actually, that's not 100% true. I was in Fort Hood briefly. I was actually with a Bell County commissioner, and I was taking a tour of the Perry Haynes land, which is really far out there and has its own story to it. And I went over this really rocky, uneven road, and there was cows just wandering in the middle of the street, and I'm like, where am I? And they were like, it was Louis Miner who was driving. He's like, you're on Fort Hood. And I was like, okay.
And you were out looking at this remote area that might be a park or something one day.
Right.
And you had to go either on or through some federal property, which
Right.
is Fort Hood, to get there.
Right.
And Fort Hood is very vast. Brent, do you know how many acres it is? It's
Not off the top of my head. It's tens
of
about millions, maybe.
Maybe, I don't know. Maybe
It's
or a
quite
few hundred
large.
thousand, maybe. I don't know. Yeah, it's a lot.
Quite a large swath of land.
And part of the reason it's so big is because the Army does a lot of training. So when the Army's not at war, which is most of the time, thankfully, then the Army's training. So they have to have all these training ranges, to fire all these big guns and, and roll around on all the vehicles. So you need a big training area, and Fort Hood provides that. And it's very remote too. You can go out and there's no, there's not a lot of street lights and things like that, or even roads. There's not many roads on most of Fort Hood, except what they call the garrison area, and that's where the buildings are. The commissaries, the barracks, headquarters buildings, stuff like that. But that's only, Brent, maybe you can describe. That's only a small portion of Fort Hood.
Right. It's like it's the main installation is like I guess if you compare it with like a city and a county, it's the city, and the training area is more like the rural kind of expanse of land. There's not really much going on out there unless people are on exercises, which I guess happen pretty often.
So my experience with Fort Hood, I went to junior high and high school in Texas, in West Texas, but I'd never been to the Fort Hood area. But after high school, I joined the Army and went to basic training in Fort Knox, Kentucky. And then at the end of basic training, they were telling us where our first duty station would be. We were in a theater at Fort Knox, and the drill sergeant would yell out a name and then the base, like Johnson, you're going to Fort Bragg. And then Brooks came up and he said, you're going to Fort Hood. And I was like, oh, okay, that's Texas. I knew it was in Texas. I was like, that's kind of good. My parents still live in Texas. And then there was another soldier, when he heard I was going to Fort Hood, he turned around and he said, oh, there's a drag there. I'm like, a drag? And, he was talking about like a street where people drive up and down on a Friday or Saturday night and, hang out with their friends or go toe-to-toe with their rivals or whatever, on the drag. And I was like, oh, it's got a drag. That sounds unusual for a military base. And once I got to Fort Hood, I realized the drag was actually, what they were talking about was Rancier, which is in Killeen. But Rancier Avenue goes right up to the what they call the East Gate. And once you go through the East Gate, I think is it Battalion Avenue? Or Tank I don't know. It's one of the.
I think it might be Tank Destroyer Avenue.
Tank
that one
Destroyer.
goes east to west.
Yeah, and then of course beyond that it's Rancier, which was probably a lot more livelier in those days. But so in I think Fort Hood's reputation probably since those days has changed. That was like early 90s. And since those days has changed because there's been a lot that has happened at Fort Hood since the 90s with the shooting, the Nadal Hassan shooting in '09. And then, of course, Vanessa Guillen case got a lot of attention in, in the last 5 years. And it got a lot of attention, too, with the name change. And really, it was Fort Hood until 2023 when it became Fort Cavazos. And do you know that, Britt, can you talk about how it was changed? Why did the Army or Congress change it?
Yeah, so it all kind of boils down to the kind of rise of the Black Lives Matter protests, and
where there were a lot of Confederate monuments being taken down or questioned, at least, things
there
like
were, and that kind of actually started kind of sprung up around the time of the shooting in Charleston, at Dylan Roof in I think 2013, 14. I might be wrong there. He attacked I think it was an AME Zionist, historically black church in Charleston, South Carolina, and that kind of sparked the wider conversation of what do we do when there's monuments to Confederate troops or rebel flags flying at state capitol buildings, like in that case over the city of Columbia, where I was born actually, but and that kind of was reignited periodically over the years as more protests sprung up over individual killings of Black Americans or abuse by individual police departments, and that eventually one of the conversation did kind of turn to American military bases, which were named largely during World War II, I believe, for Confederate generals, usually Confederate officers with local connections. Maybe you can go a little more in depth.
I have an excerpt here from the. There's a book called Fort Hood: The First 50 Years. We have a copy here in the newsroom, but I'm going to read a short. Maybe it's not that short, but a paragraph. So it says, because they acquired the land through eminent domain, which means all these families that were on the land that is now Fort Hood, they were communities. They had names, and they had schools, they had buildings, they had houses, they have cemeteries. There's still cemeteries there. And, so just like a lot of Texas, it was part of, Texas. And So, but the country decided to, build an army base here, and so this excerpt says, as it dealt with the people of Central Texas, the Army tried to make the new post more palatable to them by the name chosen for it. Historically, the Army had made an effort to name its new camps and posts for military figures held in high esteem in the area for each base. In the case of the new camp at Killeen, Colonel Bruce on January 30th recommended, and the War Department agreed on February 17th, 1942, that the post would be known as Camp Hood in honor of General John Bell Hood, the fighting general who led a famous Texas brigade in the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. Hood, born in Kentucky in 1831, was a graduate of the Military Academy at West Point in 1853. He had resigned from the Army in 1861 to accept a commission in the Confederate military forces. Rising to the rank of lieutenant general, he had been a bold fighter whose major strategy was attack and who believed in never showing his enemy his back. So they took, at the time anyway, a respected military figure in Texas, and it got the name Camp Hood at the time. And if I'm not mistaken, the Army will call something a camp if they don't know how long it's going to last. If it's like, well, this might be around a few years, but we're not sure if it's going to be here permanently. But once they establish that it's going to be here permanently, then they'll put a fort, right? Is that your understanding, Brent?
I believe so. It might also have something to do with size, but I mean, most Army installations in the United States, not all. There's still a couple of camps.
Yeah, there's Camp Mabry in
There's
Austin.
Camp Mabry. That's and that is the permanent base. It's been occupied for 100 and something years at least.
But obviously not a lot of troops. It's not like Fort Hood.
No, it's kind of like where the headquarters elements of the Texas Military Department is, and there's also there's Camp Atterbury, Indiana, is another one that comes to mind. That's a National Guard base. So yeah, it's kind of weird how the Army names things. It's never really consistent across the board.
And Hood was not the only Confederate. Of course, there's, and I don't know how long these other posts have been around, but there's Fort Bragg and Fort Benning and Fort Robert E. Lee and more.
Yeah, and there's
in the South.
They're all in the South, and aside from those in Fort Hood, there's also Fort A.P. Hill. Let's see, you said Fort Lee, and then there's Fort Gordon. Yeah, Fort Gordon, Fort Rucker. I believe that's it. Gordon was named after Eisenhower before its restoration of its name.
So, but anyway, a few years ago, there was Black Lives Matter and all this, and it really even started before that, but there was a movement in the country to get the things that were named after Confederates changed.
Right, and that happened. That kind of the legislative effort in Washington definitely ramped up in 2020, late 2020, after the George Floyd protests. That initially was a prohibition passed as part of the fiscal year 21 defense bill, which was passed at the end of 2020, that prohibited the changing of any names or naming anything after Confederate soldiers, people who voluntarily served with the Confederacy. I believe it specified, as far as any military property goes. Any Department of Department of Defense property. Excuse me. And in 2021, they went a little further, a lot further, and passed as a provision in the Defense Bill for 2022 that there should be a naming commission created so that they can find new names for all currently, at the time, military properties that are named after Confederate soldiers. So that became, and that was a bipartisan effort. That was Democrats and Republicans signed on, and President Trump, in his first term, vetoed that, and they passed it over a veto, which I believe takes a 3/4 majority, 2/3 or 3/4, one or the other. I'm not a Congress expert, but
So, despite Trump's veto, it became law that Congress passed this act, or whatever it's called, to eliminate Confederate names from Army installations.
right,
And I think it's not just the names of the posts, but if there's any like if Fort Hood had a street called Robert E. Lee Boulevard, they'd have to change that too. It's
right.
any
Hood
name
Stadium.
anywhere in the on posts, and so that passed and took a while, but they came up with the name Cavazos,
Right.
who of course is General
Richard E. Cavazos.
Cavazos, who was a well-known Fort Hood and Three Corps commander here in the 80s, I think.
In the early 80s, I believe the first 2 years of the 80s, General Cavazos had been in the Korean and Vietnam conflicts and served as an Army officer there. He had been the first Hispanic general officer to reach, I believe, the 4-star rank in the 80s. That would have been after he commanded 3 Corps in Fort Hood. And he was eventually the commander of Forces Command, U.S. Army Forces Command, which is kind of the overseer of all the Army troops in the continental United States, basically.
So, and his name was already, I had heard of Cavazos because there's already a school in this area. It's in Nolanville, but it's Cavazos Elementary School. So, and it's been there 20 years or more, I'm not even sure. But, so Cavazos was already kind of like a well-respected community member. You know, they named a school after him. And I think when he died in 2017, we did a news article. You know, he died in San Antonio, where he was from, but he was still very well remembered and thought of around here. So no one, I think there was a lot of resentment for getting rid of the name Fort Hood, but Cavazos was kind of an easy choice. No one really, doubted that he deserved it or anything like that.
Right. I mean, a lot of the retired, officers that I've spoken to who were around at that time served under Cavazos. Definitely, universally, in my conversations, they've respected his leadership and thought he was just an excellent battlefield commander, an excellent training leader. He was always in the field with the troops. So,
Kevin, what's your take on the name Fort Hood?
Well, I grew up in New York, and I'm not like as attached to the name as a lot of people who grew up here, so that's a factor. I suppose that I don't necessarily agree with naming things after Confederate generals, but like I said, I'm coming from like sort of an outsider's perspective here. When I moved to Killeen initially, I only knew it as Fort Cavazos, and was only vaguely aware of the attachment people had to the name of Fort Hood. So it didn't really like impact me in the same way as it would other people. I don't have a military background. I was basically a journalist who, went from place to place and ended up here. And obviously, when I got the job here, I researched Fort Hood and Fort Cavazos, and so I had a basic understanding of like how important veterans were to the community and how important the base was to the economy. With all that said, though, I also covered Black Lives Matter protests pretty extensively in many different iterations that it came up.
Did you cover any part of that where people were questioning Confederate monuments or statues or anything like that? Did that come up in your reporting?
Well, the thing is, I was based in New York for most of my life, so there's not
many.
really a lot of Confederate monuments in New York.
Yeah, probably zero.
Well, I mean, I think there actually might be a few, but I mean, who knows if they still exist now.
Yeah.
But, the conversation about like that, I remember very clearly. I remember when Charlottesville happened, and that was a huge deal for a lot of people because it was like one of the first times in a long time that there was like flagrant violence in the street over a statue. Well, but there was also underlining like tensions, racial tensions, and that sort of thing. So all this is to say that the situation that I kind of came into as a reporter in Killeen was, my experience kind of informs my like beliefs and opinions, which I won't really go crazy about, but I just don't have the same experience as people who grew up and.
Well, it's more to you. It's just a name, right? Like to me, Dallas. It's a big city. I've been to Dallas. It's nice. It's got nice things. I don't know where the name comes from. It's probably named after some guy, Mr. Dallas. I don't know. But is it named after a Confederate? I don't know.
Yeah, I think the fact that it's named after a Confederate is secondary for most people.
Yes.
I feel like it's more just they feel sort of intruded upon when all of a sudden the name has to change because of some political stuff that's going on. Now, but that doesn't mean that it's a bad thing to have changed the name to Fort Cavazos. I actually think that was probably the right thing to do. But people are just slow to change. They just don't accept it.
Well, we've been, there's been talk of, should Fort Hood's name be changed for years because of the same thing, because it's named after a Confederate, and should Confederate generals, especially, who some people will say were traitors, be honored. And Hood is like the worst of the worst, maybe. Like he was like really pro-slavery, really like we need slavery forever, even after the war. He was like, we need to go back,
So not only, and Hood, John Bell Hood, the Confederate general, he was from Kentucky originally, which stayed with the Union. He just happened to be stationed with the U.S. Army as a junior cavalry officer here in Texas when the war broke out, and then he decided, well, I'm going to go join the Confederacy, and based on in his later campaigns, based on some of his writings to General Sherman, who was kind of his battlefield opponent in the Atlanta campaign. He was very much a racist, very much believed that the North was an aggressor upon white people, And he was absolutely committed to enshrining slavery in law. So, I mean, he betrayed the country he was born in, and
I mean, the traitor thing is less pervasive for me than just the fact that he supported slavery.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it's not just. I mean, a lot of people have this mistaken notion that statues come up because of history, but it's really more. They weren't put up that long ago. A lot of them were put up in like not even like a century ago. Like they were put up in like the 40s or something. So I feel like that's kind of like a mistaken assumption that a lot of people have. As far as like Fort Hood goes, I mean, we're kind of like going sort of backwards on this issue, like of like naming things after Confederate generals, because to me, Fort Cavazos was named after a soldier who served his country honorably, and I just feel like it's a shame to kind of go back, but that's just my personal opinion.
Right, and you mentioned going back to Confederate generals. So officially, the post is named now in honor of a World War II veteran who, in World War I and II,
Colonel Hood.
Colonel Robert Benjamin Hood. Yes.
Yeah. Who was not from here.
He was not from here. He was born in Kansas. He went to Kansas State. Well, it wasn't. It was like Kansas Agricultural College or something like that then. So, and he, he went off to World War I as an officer and was an artillery commander. And in a pretty terrible battle, he won the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions in commanding an artillery battery.
Now, Brent, you were at the official renaming ceremony on Monday.
Like renaming.
Right. So what was that like? How does the Army rename stuff?
There was a lot of kind of pomp and circumstance. Any kind of ceremony in the Army has that. There was a ceremonial artillery battery, which uses a kind of smaller towed howitzers. They might be purpose built for kind of ceremonial reasons, and they fire blanks.
But there was some speakers.
There were some speakers. Well, there was General Kevin Admiral, who is the Lieutenant General, 3-star general in charge of 3 Corps in Fort Hood. He spoke, and there was a chaplain gave the invocation. Besides that, there weren't any other speakers really. The Colonel Hood's daughter, who was her name's Margaret Huffman. She is a retired Air Force captain. Didn't know that until Monday, or until the Fort Hood Public Affairs folks released a kind of profile on her and her father and her kind of upbringing. She attended, but she didn't speak. And it was kind of interesting. It was mostly I would say a little underwhelming. It was a little anticlimactic.
Because they had already, in a way, made it official. Trump and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth had already made it official.
Right, and President Trump in June, mid-June, I think it was June 10th, made a speech at Fort Bragg, which was kind of politically charged. But anyway, he said, well, we're going to rename all these bases back to their former names.
Which
and then,
it was kind of a campaign promise.
It was. He'd kind of vowed to. I think it's pretty widely believed that he really didn't like the whole passing a bill over his veto.
Yeah.
And he had vowed since 2021, 2021, that he was going to reverse those changes in whatever way he can. And this has kind of been an exercise in getting around, like finding loopholes and exploiting
Right.
them.
And the loophole is, well, okay, Congress passed an act, well, you can't have any Army base basically named after a Confederate. So they're taking the same names that the Confederates have, like Fort Hood, and finding another person with the same last name, Hood.
Right.
Colonel Hood, who was not a Confederate. So
Right.
they're getting around it like that. So it's all legal.
To me,
And
that
it's-
seems extremely disingenuous.
Oh, it is. It definitely. I mean, A.P. Hill, Fort A.P. Hill, named after another Confederate general, A.P. Hill. It was renamed Fort Anderson Penn Hill. Now they're not gonna keep Anderson. They're not gonna put Anderson Penn Hill on the signpost. It'd be about too small to put all those letters on it.
And it's three different people.
It's
right?
three different people, and they're going to call it still Fort A.P. Hill
Yeah.
because they couldn't find another guy named
Hill.
A.P. Hill. So they shoved in two other, very brave, Medal of Honor recipients who all fought in the Civil War to kind of fill in those first two initials, which, it just kind of exemplifies like was kind of all shoved together.
And it also opens the door like, okay, well, Trump and Hegseth did it, so it kind of begs the question, will the next administration, say it's a Democrat, say it's Kamala Harris, will she come in and rename all the posts again under
Right.
the same thing? Because she is the commander-in-chief and she can do it,
And all these rules about changing names on military properties came from those two bills that were passed were part of the National Defense Authorization Act, which is this huge kind of catch-all military authorization bill that sets authorizes funding for all kinds of different things under the Pentagon. And what they're working on now is the coming year's defense bill, the NDAA. And it's been a subject of debate, and in one case, the posts that were recently ordered to be renamed in Virginia, there was an amendment by Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, he's a Democrat, that would prohibit any deviation from the naming commission's recommendations. So Fort Lee would have to go back to Fort Gregg Adams, and
So
Fort
that's
A.P.
moving
Hill.
through
Right,
Congress?
that's it was included as an amendment on that bill.
So there's still a fight going on.
They're probably still gonna talk about it, but I mean, that was in. I want to say that was in the Senate Armed Services Committee before it was reported out of committee onto the floor, and that that would have meant, because all the committees are controlled by Republicans, because it's a Republican Congress, both houses. So that would mean at least a handful of Republicans also joined that amendment and signed on to that.
Kevin, what do you think? You think the Democrats are going to change the names again?
I don't know. I sometimes wonder what the Democrats' chances are in the next election, if there's even one. I genuinely believe that,
Well, Trump can't live forever, right?
well, I'm not saying that Trump's going to be like a dictator or something, but which, although a lot of people would say that he is, but I do kind of feel like the chances that right now the country's in this moment, and we just kind of have to go through it. And I think even if the Democrats get back in charge, it's going to have to be a completely different set of Democrats. And maybe those types of Democrats would want to change the name back to Fort Cavazos, but I don't know. I really feel like
They'll just move on, you think?
I kind of feel like if the Senator Chuck Schumer's and like the Hakeem Jeffries were the ones that got power again,
So
they would
kids
just
too.
keep things pretty much the same.
I mean, I think the thing to remember here is this is sort of a political sideshow. I mean, even the Cavazos family released a statement that was basically to the effect of, you know, our father slash grandfather would not have, you know, he would have followed orders and implemented a name change back to Fort Hood. You know, it wasn't his. He wouldn't have asked for a base to be named in his honor, and that he would have, you know, focused his efforts on advocating for, you know, quality of life for soldiers and you know, paying benefits for soldiers because he cared about his troops. And I mean, that's something that should probably be remembered. A name is just a name. You know, there's other stuff going on in the world. Right after Trump's announcement, I think even that announcement might have been a sideshow, because I mean, 3 days later, you know, the Israelis attacked Iran, and the U.S. was heavily involved in that conflict. So, you know, I definitely believe it's all a show of political theater.
Well, yeah. And like I say, a name is just a name. And Kevin hit on it earlier. You know, a lot of people just know Fort Hood just because it's a place and not so much named after a person. Like when I was living at Fort Hood in the barracks, it was all it was. We never talked to each other about, hey, you know who Fort Hood is named after? It's named after a Confederate. We didn't talk about that. I didn't know.
Honestly,
Yeah.
Like, oh, not going there.
Honestly,
I generally believe most people don't really care that much.
Yeah,
If
and it's just like, who's Dallas named after? I don't know. Would you go there? Sure, it's a fun place.
The people who do care about the name are very loud online, but I don't think that really truly reflects how most people actually feel
Yeah.
about the area. You know.
Yeah, and so, well, I think that's about all the time we have. I want to thank everybody for listening to us today. The
Thanks a lot.
podcast was produced by Hamida Botchway. We'll do another one next week. You can read all of our stories at kdhnews.com. The headline in Tuesday's paper, that was July 29th, 2025, was Hood Returns. Cavazos out, Hood back in, Army post ditches Revered General's name for World War I officer Hood, by Brent Johnson. You can read that at kdhnews.com today. We also have a video that Hamida got. She was at the ceremony. You can watch that on our YouTube channel. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yep.